So, did you try writing some tests on your own? Let's write some tests together now. And for this, I'll start with errors.js. Here we got two error classes in that file, and these are simply classes which I then later use to throw them as errors, and I'm setting them up as classes so that I can define which data should be packed into my error objects. And we can add a test file by adding a errors.test.js file. A vtest is already installed here, and I already have a test script set up to run my tests, so we only need to add the file here. And then, since I have two errors, I'm going to create two suites here. And the first one will be for this HTTP error class. So that's the name I give to this suite, or the identifier. Of course, it is up to you, as you learned though. And then in there, I want to create my first test. And there, I want to make sure that if I create an object based on this class, if we instantiate that class, it should contain the provided status code, message, and data. Because these are the three things that we can pass to this class constructor and that should be stored in the class. And if someone would, for example, delete this line here, our test should detect this, because then the data we pass to the constructor would not be stored anymore. So here we can set up our test status code, which could be 1 or any other number or whatever a status code is to you. Then we can add our test message, which could just be test as a string. And then our test data, which could be an object which has a property named key or any other property name, and then maybe a value of test. Again, I'm just keeping this simple here because I just need some information, some data to feed into the class constructor. It doesn't matter for this test which data it is, and therefore I'm keeping it simple. Then we create our test error here by instantiating the HTTP error, since that's the class we're testing here. And then to this constructor function call that which we have here, I pass my test status, my test message, and then the test data, of course. And now we can use expect, which also must be imported from vtest, of course. And we can expect test error dot status code to be test status. And we can then repeat this and expect the message to be the test message and the data to be the test data. And of course, that's just one way of writing my assertions. You can definitely write different tests with different assertions. This is just one possible first test. And if we now save everything and we run npm test, this fails because I named it .tests.js. It should be .test.js instead. No S at the end. And now it finds the test and it passes. And if I would now accidentally, for example, remove this line here and I then run my tests again, it would fail and basically tell me that something's wrong with this class. So this test does what it should do. Now it's just the first test. Another test we could write here for this HTTP error class would be that it should contain undefined as data if no data is provided. So we don't want any default fallback data, but instead I really want to have undefined. Maybe you want the opposite though. Maybe you want some default fallback data. Then you could test for that and adjust the error class appropriately. But here I want to have data undefined if no data, no special data that should be packed into the error object is provided. And therefore, for this scenario, I'm going to copy the code from the test before, but I'll get rid of the test data and not pass it here to the constructor. And then I expect test error.data not to be defined. And that means it's undefined, basically. Alternatively, we could also use to be undefined. That would work as well. Both approaches can be used here. And with that, we got this test as well. And this test also passes. Now, you could write more tests, and as a practice, definitely think about other things you could test, other tests you could write. Here, since I don't want to spend the majority of this section on the repetition of what we learned, I'll instead move on to the next test suite, which is on the validation error. So here I'll give it an identifier of class validation error. And in there, I want to write a very simple test where I just want to test that instances based on this validation error class should contain the provided message that should be provided to the constructor function. So here I then have my test message, which again could be test or anything like this. Then I'm creating the test error object by calling new validation error. And validation error, like HTTP error, of course, must be imported. And then to validation error, we pass the test message. Last but not least, we of course then expect test error.message to be the test message that we defined before. And that's now one test we could write for this second class. If we now again run npm test, this also passes. Now again, definitely feel free to write more tests. I will move on to the next file so that we can soon get to the more challenging parts.